Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. On March the 4th, 1933, the United States stood financially paralyzed, socially shaken, and politically strained. By that point, banks had collapsed in cascading waves, unemployment hovered near 25%, industrial production had been cut almost in half. Bread lines were stretching through city streets and farm foreclosures were devouring rural communities. Confidence had evaporated. It was into that bleak moment where even the psychological stability of the nation was being tested. Franklin D. Roosevelt placed his hand upon a Bible and delivered the words that would echo for generations. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That line's been quoted so frequently it risks sounding like a platitude. And in some sense, sure. And frankly, I actually think there's a lot that's problematic with the sentence. But Roosevelt was giving us a kind of national moral diagnosis. He knew that fear was becoming a corrosive social force for the United States. And he described it as a nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. He understood that the economic collapse had also resulted in a kind of psychological collapse of the nation. So yes, markets had failed, certainly, but beneath the financial implosion was a deeper crisis. National confidence, solidarity, shared purpose, all of these things were being threatened. So he addressed the interior condition of the American people as a united whole. The nation he inherited had endured 3 years of accelerating decline after the crash of 1929. Under President Herbert Hoover, efforts at stabilization were hesitant and uneven. Hoover had the administrative competence and humanitarian concern, but he governed during a time when public patience had expired. By 1933, thousands of banks had closed. Depositors had lost savings accumulated over decades. Entire towns had grown suspicious of institutions. Anger was simmering. Ideological extremes were gaining traction, including populist demagogues and fringe social movements. They promised sweeping transformations. Roosevelt did something politically that was daring during his inaugural address. He admitted the severity of what was going on. He didn't pretend to deny it. He acknowledged that values have shrunken to fantastic levels. Taxes have risen. Our ability to pay has fallen. And he described the withered leaves of industrial enterprise lying on every side. And that wasn't ornamental rhetoric. It was candid description. But at the same time, though, he refused to surrender the moral vocabulary of the founders, which I found to be commendable. He insisted that this great nation will endure as it has endured, it will revive, and it will prosper. That conviction was based on a shared civic sense of faith in our constitutional order, in the moral capacity of our citizens. So Roosevelt spoke openly about divine accountability. He asked the people to join him in prayer. He declared that the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. He was drawing from a biblical image of the Gospels. And he was being deliberate about that. He was framing economic corruption in biblical terms, in moral terms. And he suggested that national renewal required ethical restoration. That language is alien to us today in a lot of ways, but that communicates that in some ways we had a president who still assumed that religious imagery would resonate with the citizenry. He was right, though. Roosevelt's Episcopalian faith shaped his outlook more than contemporary commentators often acknowledge. He was raised in a household where scripture was read, and so Episcopal liturgy was a familiar concept. He carried a steady confidence in the reality of divine providence. He frequently referenced prayer in public remarks. His concept of stewardship actually reflected a moral seriousness about power. He believed that the presidency carried a sacred trust. In his first inaugural address, he stated that he would ask Congress for broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency. He understood that while the constitutional boundaries remained, that was an emergency situation, and his leadership had to function as a kind of active guardianship over national welfare. At the same time, though, a serious appraisal of his presidency requires that we acknowledge the failures that he had. Roosevelt's New Deal expanded federal authority dramatically and drastically. Many programs offered relief and infrastructure development, but critics argued that the executive reach grew expansively and was intrusive, and they were right. And in fact, I don't think even Roosevelt foresaw just how far the New Deal would go. The attempt to pack the Supreme Court in 1937 was because he was impatient with judicial limits. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II was a grave violation of civil liberties in some ways. The president at the time, Roosevelt, he spoke eloquently of fear, but he also signed an order that institutionalized suspicion towards this entire ethnic community. Now, in some ways, we can argue for the fact that it was warranted, but it did go to drastic extremes. History documents his courage and his era, but I don't want to villainize the man entirely. Roosevelt was trying to display qualities that, at that point, contemporary politics didn't acknowledge or reward, let alone today. He communicated consistently and confidently. He did his fireside chats. He tried to explain policy to the people in plain language. He addressed the citizens as participants, not spectators in the American Republic. He conveyed the seriousness of the circumstances of the day, and I guess some could honestly argue it was without theatrical excess. He had a steady tone when he communicated all this, and frankly, he was committing unprecedented federal intervention, for good or for ill. He understood that his leadership, though, required shaping the public morale. The social context of 1933 differed profoundly from our present era. The country then was ubiquitously more religiously observant. Church attendance was widespread. Civic associations were flourishing. Families remained geographically stable. Media ecosystems were limited, and they were relatively unified, actually. So a president at that time could address the entire nation and assume that millions would hear the same words at the same time and receive it in roughly, largely the same way. But today, the landscape is evolved, fluid, and fragmented. Digital platforms generate perpetual outrage. Digital algorithms amplify political division. Information flows at an unprecedented rate and often without verification. And so the notion of civic collective trust has eroded rather quickly, actually. Contemporary America today enjoys higher aggregate wealth, advanced technology, and a diversified global presence. But psychologically, our anxiety levels are elevated. Many of our citizens have distrust towards institutions, government, media, corporations, universities, you name it. Cultural disputes have consumed our public attention, and identity politics are fragmenting our shared narratives. In 1933, the crisis centered upon material scarcity. In 2026, the crisis centers upon questions of meaning, of cohesion, of moral direction. So why has this shift occurred? Well, several factors converged. First, economic globalization and automation. The labor markets look different. There's dislocation even amidst our prosperity. Secularization has weakened our common moral framework. We've forgotten God in the public sphere. Third, decades of political polarization have incentivized performative conflict so that we don't know how to compromise and hold on to principles anymore. And finally, our civic education has declined in depth. We're teaching our students to be critical of everything and to learn to think about nothing. Many Americans are unfamiliar with constitutional structures, the philosophical roots of the republic, and I say this firmly, the fact that our founders drafted the most brilliant and the indescribably brilliant political documents and political structure in government in human history. So Roosevelt, like many earlier presidents, retained a living awareness of the founding ethos. He talked about the Constitution frequently. He assumed that liberty required ordered government. His rhetoric was an inherited belief. America had a providential role that's grounded in natural rights and moral responsibility. So even when expanding federal programs, he situated them within constitutional processes. You can argue for the overreach. I would agree with you, frankly. But he did seek congressional authorization to some degree. He did seek public legitimacy. You compare this with the tone of earlier leaders like Washington, Abraham Lincoln. Washington warned us against factionalism in his farewell address. I've quoted it before. He touted it as a force that agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies. Lincoln, in his second inaugural, essentially did the same thing. He said that divine judgment might continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. Those presidents framed our political conflict within moral and spiritual language and horizons. Roosevelt was trying to operate in that tradition. Again, like or hate the man, we still had a collective census of a religiosity, but today our public discourse is transactional and tribal. So what pathways forward emerge? Well, first, we need as citizens to let go of fear, resentment, and despair, and to have a sense of hope in moving forward. Secondly, we need to be honest about the brilliance of our Constitution and have a renewed respect for our Constitution, our constitutional structure, and frankly, the history of our nation. Third, civic education. We need to be better at it, a lot better. Fourth, personal virtue matters at the individual, familial, social, and church level. And finally, you and I as Americans must rediscover gratitude for what we have, the inheritance that we received from earlier generations. Our founders articulated principles of limited government, individual liberty, and moral accountability under God. Those are things that we ought to celebrate. Roosevelt told us we do not distrust the future of essential democracy. That sentence should land on all of us. Our essential Republican democracy depends upon virtuous citizens, accountable institutions, and leaders who understand the office as service, not just clownish spectacle. And if we can honor all of that, we actually can turn the tide in our nation for the better and for our flourishing. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.